Before we begin, I need to ask you something. Stories like this are not easy to tell, and they are even harder to hear. If you feel the weight of these forgotten voices, if you believe these hidden histories deserve to be uncovered, then subscribe to this channel. It costs nothing, but it keeps these buried truths from fading back into silence. They say every family has its secrets, the kind whispered about but never spoken aloud. Some lie buried beneath the weight of shame, hidden in diaries, old letters, and the cracked walls of abandoned homes. But there is one clan, lost in the hollows of Appalachia, whose story is so dark, so unbroken, it defies the very notion of normal family life. They never married outside their bloodline. For generations, they kept their lineage pure, their gene pool sealed in a closed loop of desire, obsession, and a quiet kind of madness. To an outsider, their isolation might have seemed quaint, an eccentricity of rural life, but the truth was far more sinister. Children were born knowing only each other, and the bonds they shared were twisted, intimate, and inevitably destructive. The first record of this clan goes back to the early 1800s, tucked away in county registries and tattered church records. At first glance, it seemed ordinary. Names repeated in strange patterns, cousins marrying cousins, uncles taking wives who were in blood nieces. Patterns that the casual historian might dismiss as coincidence slowly began to reveal themselves as a deliberate design. They built houses close together, always in the same valley, near the same stream, refusing to venture beyond what they knew. Outsiders were rare visitors, and when they did arrive, they left quickly, unnerved by the thick, uneasy silence that hung over the land. To live among them was to feel a creeping tension, as though the air itself remembered the acts committed beneath it. Grandparents shared more than stories with grandchildren. They shared whispers of past unions, of children who never thrived, of births that carried shadows as much as flesh. Medical records from the mid-20th century describe a pattern of deformities, developmental delays, and fragile health. Local doctors, those few willing to enter the valley, left with more questions than answers, often speaking quietly of the curse that seemed to cling to the family like a second skin. And yet, the clan persisted, stubbornly insular, almost proud of their isolation. Their story is not one of violence or sudden tragedy. It is subtler, far more unsettling. It is the quiet horror of repetition, of a family trapped in its own design. Every marriage, every birth was a thread woven into a tapestry no one else could fully see, a tapestry of obsession and secrecy that stretched across centuries. They were survivors, but survivors of what? Of loyalty, of madness, or simply of an unyielding devotion to themselves, to their own blood. By the time the 20th century arrived, the wider world had almost forgotten they existed. Maps did not mark their land, history books ignored their presence, and the telephone rarely rang with a voice from that valley. But for those who stumbled across the truth, the reaction was the same: shock, disbelief, and a creeping, almost physical unease. Something about this clan, about the way they lived and loved, defied nature and morality alike. And as we peel back the layers of their history, you will see why they became known, quietly and horrifically, as the most inbred clan the United States has ever produced. Generations passed in that valley, each more insular than the last. Children grew up knowing only the boundaries of their family's land and the faces of those they were genetically bound to. Stories were passed down with ritualistic precision, as if to reinforce loyalty to blood over all else. No one spoke of the wider world. The idea of leaving, of marrying beyond the valley, was not just frowned upon, it was inconceivable. Even small acts of curiosity, like visiting a neighboring town, were discouraged, often met with quiet scorn or ominous warnings. "Our blood is our strength," they would whisper to the children, a mantra repeated so often it became a kind of liturgy. There was a strange rhythm to their lives, a heartbeat synchronized with the valley itself. Births, deaths, marriages, they all followed the same patterns as those who came before. At family gatherings, the air was thick with an intimacy that outsiders could never comprehend. Cousins held hands a little too long. Uncles spoke to nieces with a familiarity that set visitors on edge. But to the clan, this was normal, even sacred. Their loyalty to one another outweighed everything else: love, morality, even survival. They were bound together not just by genetics, but by a shared understanding that leaving, even emotionally, was a betrayal. Medical oddities began to appear more frequently as decades passed. Children were born with subtle deformities, peculiar behaviors, and health issues that doctors struggled to explain. Some had difficulty walking, some spoke in patterns that seemed almost ritualistic, and a few never spoke at all. Outsiders who dared to investigate these anomalies often described an atmosphere of oppressive secrecy, of whispered conversations abruptly halted, of eyes watching from behind thin curtains. It was as if the family instinctively knew they were being judged and recoiled from intrusion. But this clan did not see themselves as cursed. On the contrary, they considered their isolation a mark of purity. They referred to outsiders as the diluted, dismissing the rest of the world as unworthy of their attention. Festivals, holidays, and rites of passage were all celebrated within the family unit, reinforcing the cycle of inbreeding with subtle psychological reinforcement. The elders took meticulous notes of bloodlines, tracking unions and ensuring that their children would marry the correct partners, often cousins several times removed. In their minds, it was science, it was tradition, it was survival. By the mid-1900s, the valley had become almost mythic. Local townsfolk spoke of strange lights in the windows, of children whose eyes seemed too old for their faces, of adults whose speech carried an eerie cadence. Rumors of their inbreeding circulated quietly, but no one dared confront them directly. The family was a living, breathing anomaly, and their insularity only deepened the mystery. Those who tried to pry into their lives often left the valley feeling haunted, as if the very earth had absorbed the secrets of generations and whispered them in dreams. As the 20th century wore on, the clan's presence became almost spectral, a family living in the shadows of modern America, untouched by progress, untouched by scrutiny. School records show children attending classes for brief periods before being pulled home, educated in the ways of their ancestors rather than the wider world. Their literacy was functional, enough to maintain family records and write letters to other clan members, but it never extended beyond the valley's borders. Every lesson reinforced a single truth: the outside world was dangerous, and the only safe place was among their own blood. Visitors to the valley, though rare, described an unsettling uniformity in appearances. Facial features repeated like echoes across generations. Eyes, noses, and jawlines mirrored those of parents and grandparents, forming a gallery of subtle, unbroken resemblance. It was not grotesque at first glance, but beneath the surface lingered a sense of wrongness, a quiet tension that left observers uneasy. Doctors called it inbreeding. Locals called it strange. But the family called it destiny. Every birth, every union was preordained. They were not living lives, they were fulfilling a pattern laid down long before they were born. Within the family there was a strange social hierarchy governed by bloodline purity. Elders presided over marriages, instructing which cousins should unite and which unions should be avoided, all in the name of maintaining the integrity of the clan. Rebellion was rare, but when it occurred, it was met with both subtle coercion and psychological pressure. Children who expressed curiosity about life beyond the valley were made to feel shame, as if their very thoughts endangered the family. Some left for brief periods, only to return broken and chastened, their voices carrying the same cadence of submission that had governed generations. The psychological impact of this insularity cannot be overstated. In interviews with distant relatives, those who escaped described an almost hypnotic control, a sense that the family's expectations reached into every thought, every desire, every heartbeat. Intimacy, for them, was synonymous with family. Love existed, but only in the narrow corridors of shared ancestry. Sexuality was not forbidden, it was confined. Every connection was measured, weighed, and justified by the lens of blood. Outsiders could see only the physical manifestations of this insularity, but the deeper horror lay in the invisible architecture of the mind, the way loyalty and obsession intertwined until they became indistinguishable. Medical reports, diaries, and oral histories all point to the same conclusion. This was a clan that had chosen its own isolation, that had codified its obsession with blood into a living, breathing institution, and in doing so they created a reality that defied both nature and morality. The valley became a stage for repetition, a theater of human endurance twisted into something darkly unique. Their story is not one of tragedy in the traditional sense. It is a horror that seeps quietly into the bones, a slow reveal of human obsession left unchecked for generations. By the time the 1970s arrived, the valley had become a place that existed almost entirely outside the collective memory of the surrounding world. The roads leading into it were narrow and overgrown, and mail rarely reached the families that lived there. Outsiders who ventured too close often reported an atmosphere thick with silence, broken only by the occasional bark of a dog or the creak of a swing in a yard where no children played. The clan's presence was palpable, but never overt. They moved like shadows, always watching, always calculating. Inside their homes, life followed the rhythms established long before the arrival of electricity, radio, or television. Meals were shared, labor was communal, and children were taught their place in the family hierarchy from the earliest age. They were never allowed to forget their lineage. Each child memorized not only the names of ancestors, but the exact relationships, the union of one cousin with another, the repetition of bloodlines over decades. Deviations were corrected with subtle threats, with withdrawn affection, with the kind of psychological pressure that builds quietly yet relentlessly over years. Health complications were rampant, though the family treated them as ordinary burdens rather than signals of genetic risk. Children were born with fragile constitutions, with deformities that varied in severity. Some never walked, some never spoke, and some seemed trapped in a perpetual half-awareness, never fully present in the world around them. Yet, in the twisted logic of the family, these outcomes were not tragedies. They were proof of survival, proof of endurance, proof of loyalty to the bloodline above all else. Outsiders who tried to document the family's lives often left with stories too strange to publish. A doctor noted that even the most minor illnesses carried an air of inevitability, as if the family at sea had preordained who would survive and who would suffer. Teachers, when pressed, spoke of children who understood human interaction only in the narrow confines of family structures, whose play and conversation revolved around people whose DNA they shared. Every act reinforced the closed-loop existence of the clan, and every birth ensured that the pattern would continue. By the late 20th century, the valley had earned a reputation among locals as a place both cursed and protected, a living artifact of inbreeding so extreme it defied explanation. Legends grew, tales of children born with uncanny knowledge, of adults whose memories extended generations beyond their own, of a family that seemed to age and reproduce according to its own internal clock. They were isolated, yes, but remarkably enduring. In a way, they were immortal, not in body, but in the continuity of blood, in a repetition so precise it became almost ritualistic, almost sacred, and almost unbearable to the mind of anyone who tried to comprehend it. By the 1990s, the family had become a legend whispered about in nearby towns, a tale told in hushed tones to children as a warning or a thrill. Few had seen them, and even fewer dared approach. Those who did spoke of eyes that seemed too knowing, of voices carrying the cadence of decades, of an atmosphere heavy with unspoken rules and invisible walls. Time in the valley seemed distorted, as if the family existed outside the normal progression of years, repeating the same cycles with a devotion bordering on the ritualistic. Marriages continued, generation after generation, each union carefully monitored by the elders. They maintained meticulous records, sometimes dating back 2 centuries, ensuring that no bloodline was ever diluted. Cousins married cousins, second cousins married second cousins, and the pattern persisted with an almost obsessive precision. The family believed that by preserving the purity of their lineage, they were protecting something sacred, an inheritance not of wealth or land, but of blood itself. Love, desire, and family loyalty were inseparable, entwined in a web so intricate that leaving it was unthinkable. Psychologically, the impact on children was profound. Many grew up with an intimate knowledge of their ancestry that bordered on obsession. They understood relationships not in the way outsiders do, but as a network of connections that defined their very existence. Friendship, romantic interest, even casual interactions were filtered through the lens of family. To step outside this lens was to step into danger, both socially and emotionally. Those who questioned the rules were met not with violence, but with a quiet, corrosive pressure that eroded self-confidence and reshaped desire. Health issues continued to compound with each generation. Doctors who managed to study the family reported higher rates of congenital disorders, cognitive delays, and physical abnormalities. But within the valley, these were not signs of weakness. They were markers of survival, badges of belonging. Life was measured not by typical milestones, but by endurance within the closed system of the family. Every birth, every marriage, every life lived was another thread woven into the same tapestry, another step along a path defined entirely by blood. By the dawn of the 21st century, outsiders had mostly given up trying to understand the clan. Researchers, journalists, and curious locals all retreated, unnerved by the quiet intensity of a family that had mastered the art of self-containment. And yet, for all their secrecy, the story persisted. Echoes of a family that refused to leave its own shadow, whose obsession with blood had created a world so isolated, so precise, that it became almost a different reality entirely. If you're still watching, you're already braver than most. Tell us in the comments, what would you have done if this was your bloodline? The valley today remains a place suspended in time, where the modern world brushes past, but never truly enters. Satellite images show houses clustered tightly together, farmland meticulously maintained, and roads that vanish into thick forests, as if nature itself is conspiring to hide the clan from view. Residents rarely appear in public records, and when they do, it is under the same names repeated across generations, a continuity that is both remarkable and unnerving. The pattern persists. The bloodline, preserved with deliberate care, remains unbroken. Inside their homes, life is as it always was. Rituals, meals, and education revolve around the family unit, reinforcing the insularity that has defined them for centuries. Children are taught the lineage from birth, memorizing names, unions, and connections as sacred knowledge. Relationships are guided by elders, and the outside world is a dangerous abstraction, full of people whose presence threatens the delicate balance of blood and loyalty. To the clan, outsiders are irrelevant. They are observers, intruders in a world that has been carefully curated for generations. Medical challenges remain, though the family's approach has shifted subtly over time. Some have sought treatment beyond the valley, cautiously, while others rely on remedies passed down through the generations. Yet, even here, the patterns of inbreeding are evident: fragile health, developmental delays, and peculiar traits that have become hallmarks of the clan. For the family, these are not warnings but proof of endurance. Each life born is a testament to survival within the strict confines of tradition, a living record of devotion to their own blood. Psychologically, the impact is profound. Children grow up in a reality where love, loyalty, and obligation are inseparable. Intimacy exists only within the family. Curiosity about the outside world, defied, is tempered by a deep, almost instinctual fear, a sense that stepping beyond the valley is stepping into danger. Those who have left rarely return, and those who attempt to bridge the gap between the valley and the wider world find themselves torn between two incompatible realities. The clan exists in a bubble, and the air outside it is toxic to their sense of identity. And so, the most inbred clan in American history continues, largely unseen, largely forgotten, yet terrifyingly present. Their story is not one of sensationalized violence or sudden calamity. It is the slow, relentless erosion of human normalcy, the creation of a world defined entirely by blood. To understand them is to confront the limits of morality, of nature, and of human obsession. They are a living archive of secrets, a family whose devotion to itself has shaped a reality both fascinating and horrifying, and whose story lingers long after you leave the valley, haunting your thoughts in ways you may never fully understand. There is a quiet horror in watching the family persist, generation after generation, as if the valley itself has conspired to keep them alive, untouched by outside judgment. Their lives are a slow-motion repetition, a choreography of survival that outsiders can glimpse only in fragments. Every birth, every marriage, every whispered instruction reinforces the same cycle, and those who question it are quickly absorbed back into the pattern or pushed away entirely. The family has become both prisoner and warden of its own blood, a paradox of isolation and continuity that defies understanding. Elders remain the ultimate arbiters of life within the valley. They maintain control through knowledge, through authority, and through a deep understanding of psychological influence. To them, the world outside is irrelevant, even dangerous. Outsiders are permitted only brief observation, never integration, and even those with genuine curiosity are discouraged by subtle manipulations, veiled threats, or cold indifference. In this way, the family has preserved its reality, protecting the closed loop that has defined their existence for centuries. Children born into this system inherit more than genetic traits. They inherit an entire worldview. Loyalty is absolute, family is sacred, and the patterns of the past are the only guide for the future. Education, relationships, and even play are governed by these rules, creating a self-contained society that functions according to a logic outsiders may never grasp. Each member is both a product and a perpetuator of the clan, sustaining a legacy that is at once fascinating and grotesque. Despite its insularity, the clan has survived into the modern era, adapting only minimally to the outside world while retaining the core of its identity. Electricity, cars, and limited media have reached the valley, yet they have not fundamentally altered the family's structure or beliefs. Modernity touches the edges, but the heart remains resolutely preserved. In a sense, the valley exists as a living museum, a record of human obsession and isolation that continues to function exactly as it did hundreds of years ago. To encounter this family, even indirectly, is to confront a truth many would rather ignore: that human beings are capable of sustaining patterns that seem unnatural, even immoral, for the sake of survival, tradition, and obsession. Their story is not merely an oddity of history, it is a mirror reflecting the extremes of loyalty, inheritance, and the human instinct to preserve itself above all else. The valley is their world, and in that world, blood is everything. Even now, the valley seems suspended in time, a place where the outside world is little more than a rumor. Children grow up memorizing their lineage before they can read maps, learning not geography but genealogy, tracing connections that stretch back centuries. Love, desire, and family loyalty are inseparable, intertwined in a way that outsiders can barely comprehend. To the clan, this is not abnormal. It is sacred, a covenant written into flesh and reinforced with each birth. Health complications, so long a hallmark of inbreeding, persist. Subtle deformities, cognitive delays, and physical frailties mark the new generations, but the family treats these as ordinary burdens, signs of endurance rather than failure. Each child born is both a continuation and a proof that the clan can survive, that the bloodline remains unbroken, and that their isolated world remains intact. Life is measured in loyalty, in survival within the closed circle, and in the repetition of what came before. Psychologically, the clan's members carry the weight of centuries of self-imposed isolation. Their social universe is narrow but intensely intricate, every interaction shaped by bloodlines and the invisible rules set by elders. Curiosity about the outside world is tempered by instinctive fear. The very thought of leaving is disorienting, even dangerous. Those who do attempt it are rarely the same upon return, their identities fractured by the collision of two incompatible realities. The valley is a crucible that molds both body and mind, preserving a society defined entirely by its own obsession. The clan's endurance into the 21st century is remarkable, not for technological adaptation, but for the sheer persistence of its social and biological structures. Modern life brushes past, but the valley remains a fortress of continuity. Generations continue to marry within the bloodline, sustaining patterns established centuries ago, ensuring that the web of connections, loyalty, and obsession remains unbroken. It is a world apart, one that is at once fascinating, horrifying, and impossible to fully comprehend. In the end, this is the legacy of the most inbred clan in American history. Their story is not one of dramatic violence or public scandal, but of quiet, relentless preservation. They are a testament to the extremes of human loyalty, the power of isolation, and the sometimes terrifying consequences of obsession with blood. To witness it, even from afar, is to confront a truth that lingers long after you've left the valley, that some families are capable of sustaining themselves in ways the outside world may never understand, and perhaps is better off not trying to. And now we arrive at the final chapter of this unsettling story, the truth that has endured for centuries despite the world's ignorance. The most inbred clan in American history is not defined by crime, scandal, or sudden tragedy. Their horror is quieter, subtler, but far more enduring. It lies in the repetition of generations, the meticulous preservation of bloodlines, and the psychological architecture that binds every member to the same rigid, insular reality. They are a living archive of human obsession, a family that has refused to compromise with the outside world in any form. As the valley continues to exist, largely unseen, its legacy persists in the faces of children, in the cadence of speech, in the invisible rules that govern every interaction. Elders watch with a quiet satisfaction, knowing that the patterns of the past have survived intact. Each new birth, each carefully arranged union, is another thread in a tapestry that spans centuries, a testament to endurance, loyalty, and a devotion to blood that defies common morality. Outsiders may see deformities, health complications, and social peculiarities, but the family sees continuity. They see proof that their world is preserved, that their ancestors' intentions have been honored, and that the valley remains theirs alone. What is perhaps most haunting is the realization that this story could have been lost entirely. Forgotten records, whispered rumors, and the isolation of the valley itself ensured that few could ever glimpse the truth. Yet the clan persisted, stubbornly invisible, a shadow upon the American landscape, preserving a pattern of life that challenges the very notion of normalcy. And when we look back, when we trace the twisted lineage of generations who never married outside their bloodline, we confront not only the extremities of human behavior, but the fragility of what we consider moral or natural. Their world is at once an object of fascination and a warning. It is a place where human desire, loyalty, and obsession collide with biology, producing outcomes both remarkable and disturbing. The valley stands as a monument to the extremes of isolation, a living experiment in blood and continuity that no outsider could have orchestrated. And perhaps that is the most terrifying part, that this family, this clan, has endured not through force or spectacle, but through quiet, relentless adherence to their own rules, existing in a reality entirely of their own making. In the end, the story of the most inbred clan is a story of human obsession left unchecked, of loyalty to blood elevated above all else, and of a family whose devotion to itself has created a world both haunting and unforgettable. Their lives are a reminder that some truths are buried for a reason, that some legacies are meant to remain hidden, and that even in the quietest corners of America, the human capacity for secrecy, obsession, and endurance knows no bounds. The valley waits. The family continues. And their story, though largely unseen, lingers in the shadows, haunting those who dare to uncover it.